Hello and welcome to the World Wanders podcast, your source for travel stories, travel destinations, and travel philosophy.
I'm Amanda.
I'm Ryan.
And we're your hosts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this episode of the World Wanderers podcast. Today, we are really excited to share with you a conversation we had with Kenny Rayman about Russia. Russia is a country that is not at the top of the list when you start thinking or asking people about their bucket lists. You need a visa to travel there. It's not the beach and white sand destination that people often think of when they think of their first travel opportunities. And there are other complicating factors. But with Kenny, he had a passion for the history, something when he was younger really sparked inside of him to want to learn more about the history and the culture, and that really influenced his decisions to travel. So we're excited to talk to him more about this place that not a lot of people think of as a travel destination, about the history, about why he cares, and about his experiences there. But before we dive into that episode, we want to talk a little bit about our new initiative on Patreon, the World Wanderers Insider.
Yeah, this is an initiative that's brand new that we just launched last week. So if you listened to last week's episode of the podcast on our journey as digital nomads, then you've got a little taste for what the Insider is all about. And if you haven't listened to that episode, go ahead and listen to it. It is fun and insightful, and we'll just give you kind of an inside peek into a little bit more about what we're doing behind the scenes, especially since, on Instagram and Facebook, we give you a lot of the highlight moments, and a lot of you might be like, how on earth do you afford to do this? So we talk a lot about that in that episode. And then also with the Insider, we actually launched with 3 episodes. So we have the episode with us talking about our digital nomad path. We have one with Sasha from the Grateful Gypsies talking about becoming a freelance writer and running a blog as well as teaching English. And then we also have one with Becky Gillespie from the School of Travels podcast and Tokyo Becky talking about being a digital nomad proofreader. And this is a super, super interesting job because when you think digital nomad, this isn't always what you think about. So there are already 3 episodes on there for you to listen to, and there will be lots more coming soon. We're going to be releasing 1 new episode per month, and the one for next month is already a good one. So if that's something you're interested in, you can head on over to patreon.com/theworldwanderers. And we just wanted to give a quick little shout out to KDP. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast on Patreon. We are super, super grateful to have you as a part of our Patreon and World Wanderers Insider community. So once again, that's patreon.com/worldwanderers. And now on to the episode with Kenny Rayman.
All right, so welcome back to the podcast. Today, we are really excited to be joined by Kenny Rayman. Kenny, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you for having me on.
So we've got a whole bunch of stuff we want to pick your brain about. But before we dive too much into Russia and all that comes with it, tell us a little bit more about how you got into traveling. Was it something that was part of your life growing up, or what was that thing that lit the travel spark for you?
Travel was definitely not something I did as a kid. We had only a couple of family vacations that I can remember. The way I got into travel was my father passed away and gave me a little bit of an inheritance, and I chose to do some more things before traveling. Finally, about a year after he passed, I thought, why don't I do something bigger for myself? And I have the ability financially now to take a little bit of a bigger step. And I've always wanted to go to Russia, so why not get my passport and just go for that lifetime dream trip that I've always wanted to take.
And what was it about Russia that kind of had captured your imagination?
The fascination with Russia really started when I've always, even as a kid, I always wanted to understand things. The face value of something really didn't gel with me. There was always something I wanted to know about the backstory. And the first thought of Russia that I had was through the movie Rocky IV. And that was against Rocky Balboa versus the big Russian boxer. And the Cold War narrative was all through that. And as a 5-year-old, I'm sitting there trying to understand a political construct. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what politics meant. I just knew it was a big, scary, tall guy beating up on a smaller guy. And after I was like, okay, he was evil, but how am I supposed to how am I supposed to hate all the people around him? And then I learned about the story of the Romanovs, the ruling family, the dynastic family that were murdered back in 1918. So to a 5-year-old, that spoke Cinderella tale with no happy ending. I didn't understand anything other than a Disney tale that Prince Charming just didn't have a happy ending. And then after that, it was Fievel with American Tail and Fievel Goes West. So I never had that adversarial feel to Russia. I just had okay, I want to learn more about this. How did we get from A to B?
And so when was it that you took that first trip? And then if, I think when people, especially for us, like our story with travel is kind of like a lightly getting our feet wet, right? Like we went to Western Europe and backpack. That's like the stereotypical thing. What was it like first time out of the US being in a country that is so different?
It was definitely, I'd never even been to Canada. Like I've never gone through a border patrol or border crossing. So I had no idea what to expect. My first time going through any type of border passport control, the line was insanely long in the airport. It was actually wrapping around the concourse and into another concourse. I had to go find the security guard to, so I was thinking I was going to miss my flight. So I was having to step out and say, I need help, which was something that I was not ready for. I was like, okay, you have to speak up for yourself. You have to step out of your comfort zone. And it was the same thing with the Russian border control. I was just, okay, enough Russian to get yourself, to answer their questions about where you come from, why you're there. And, I just wasn't necessarily sure about the process. But as soon as I got into the city, I felt as if I were home because of all of the research that I'd done in the previous decades of my life. I just felt as if I were finally home.
And so what year was that?
That was 2017. My birthday was May 15th, and I think I got into Russia on the 17th. I had to spend a few days in Finland just because I didn't write the correct date on my visa application for Russia.
Wow. And so you learned a little bit of the Russian language before going?
I tried to learn with Rosetta Stone. I learned enough to basically be polite, ask simple questions, understand simple answers, but anything with complicated sentence structure was testing my limits. So it was enough to make them think, okay, thank you so much for trying. We understand you're struggling a little bit. We know some English, so we can switch. That was only in certain businesses. Like I walked into a cell phone carrier. The person behind the counter didn't speak any English, so I had to just figure out, oh, that's exactly what I need behind you. Can I buy it? But in restaurants, I was able to order my food and just ask, can I have some creamer? Can I have some coffee? Those types of things.
Yeah, wow. I can imagine that would be super difficult. I know virtually nothing about the Russian language other than what I've seen in like movies and TV and stuff. But as an English speaker, as a native English speaker, when you hear it, it's clearly very different from English. So, yeah, I think it's amazing that you approach that as like, hey, I should learn some of this language. And so I'm curious, what was the plan for that first trip? Like, where were you going? What were you planning to do? And all that good stuff.
That first trip was to really, I had two goals for St. Petersburg. And the two goals were to see Catherine the Great's sarcophagus in the Cathedral of St. Peter and Paul on the Peter and Paul Fortress area, and then to see the sarcophagus to the royal family that were murdered in 1918. I really felt as if it was kind of like a historical pilgrimage. My guide actually asked me, she said, well, we have so many places that we're supposed to visit on this day. Which would you like to start? And without a hesitation, I just said, I want to see the Romanovs. It was one of those lifetime things that I knew I had to see. And through the process of getting to know, I didn't want to just blurt out that I'm a historical fanatic. I had to really just ease into the story of this is why I want to see it. This is, what I know. I surprised my guide with a few things that I knew that she was like, oh, a typical tourist wouldn't know that. How do you know that?
Okay. Yeah, that's really cool. And so I think it obviously depends place to place, but there's certainly a lot of places when, like, for example, we were going to the Philippines and we're both from Canada. A little ways before that, maybe like a month or two before it, our family had seen on the news that like a couple of Canadians had been beheaded in the Philippines by like ISIS terrorists on one of the islands. I think Russia's probably like one of those places where certain people, depending on what they're reading, what they're looking at, might feel like similarly like, oh God, you're planning a big trip. There was kind of like thoughts and reactions of people when you're like, this is the place I want to go. This is the first place in the world I want to go. I'm planning this big trip here.
Everyone in my immediate circle was quote unquote afraid. But I knew that their fear was locked in a certain mode of thinking. I always told them, the Cold War is over. I've studied Russia enough that I have this innate sense that I can tell the background of the story. I have this sense that Russia is not what you think it is, and but that didn't stop them from saying, well, what if they revoke your visa at the last minute? Or what if you get there and they say you can't enter the country? Okay, then if they say the visa rules changed and your visa is no longer valid, they'll be like, there's the ticket counter. Go buy a ticket to leave the country. You can't enter. Or if I were in the hotel and visa laws changed, it's not like they were going to arrest me just because I was in the hotel room. They would just say, hey, the visa laws changed. You have such and such amount of time to leave the country. They would have notified me. But this sense that I was going to get off the plane and get arrested by the Secret Service just because I was American was completely unfounded.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me, I think there is, because it is kind of cast as that like conflict, right? It's like the US versus Russia was this, there was the Cold War, and it's still, I mean, even if you look in the news today, it's the bad guy once again. It's kind of like watching professional wrestling where sometimes it's the good guy, but now it's back to the bad guy. But I think a lot of people, especially a lot of Americans, might feel like going to Russia, they might not be treated well because it's kind of the opposite, right? Where Russians might think the Americans are the bad guys. What was it like, kind of like day to day interacting with people, them finding out you're from the States? Was there any of that kind of like anti-American sentiment that I think a lot of people might be afraid of?
No, I didn't personally experienced that. When people found out that I was from America, if they knew English, they'd be like, "Oh, can I practice with you?" And I tried to say, "Well, I know a little bit of Russian." And they're like, "But I can speak English, you know. I'd like to practice. You know, I can definitely communicate a little bit better with you if you speak English." When I was in the restaurant in the hotel, I'd order a traditional Russian dish, and they'd be like, "Okay, are you sure you're going to like it? You know, are you an American ordering borscht? This is going to be like, do you know what borscht is? Are you going to like it? Really, you like borscht?" And then they would see me just lap it up and eat it really happily, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, an American loves borscht." And then they wanted to know about me as soon as they got to know that, oh, he's not just here for the Instagram photo. He's not just here for a 24-hour pass. One of the hotel employees when I was in Moscow, actually after a couple of days, he had his weekend, and then he came back and he said, "Oh, by the way, if you noticed that I was gone and you were wondering where I was," and he pulled out his cell phone and just started showing me pictures of his family, and telling me what he did. He was fishing with his family at his dacha outside of Moscow, and he wanted to share with me the photos with me. So it was just interest into, oh my gosh, this is an American. He's not, the typical American that we see or that we feel. So it was really interesting to have those types of interactions.
Yeah, that's really amazing and inspiring to hear, because I think that, through the media, you do hear a lot of like, oh, as, maybe not even an American, but just as a tourist, like you're not really going to be welcome. People aren't going to be kind to you. And it sounds like you've had very much the opposite experience. And we're big believers as travelers that it's really important to go to a country and experience it personally, as opposed to get scared away by the media. And, obviously there's places that are the exception to that because they are really dangerous. But it doesn't sound like Russia falls within that category of being too dangerous to experience. Yet I think for a lot of people, they still consider it to be somewhere that's not the top of their bucket list or not the top of their, travel list or a place that they want to go. So I guess I'm curious from your perspective, obviously there's lots of things since you love Russia, but, what are some of like the top reasons why somebody should consider adding Russia to their list of places to go travel?
One, to see that it's definitely advanced past that Soviet image. We have this, like I always say when I talk to people, the first thing you see, especially in the U.S., if the Kremlin is in the news, is kind of like a hazy 1980s view of the St. Basil's, where it's not really clear, it's kind of menacing, or it's a close-up of the red lit star on the top of the Kremlin Tower at night. So it's even more menacing with that black background. You go to Moscow and there's skyscrapers that are very new and very futuristic looking. Moscow City is just a burgeoning area that's filled with these. One building looks like it's a strand of DNA that's twisting up into the air. And it's same thing with St. Petersburg. You have all of these brilliant, beautiful buildings that have just been restored from the previous era. And then once you get out into the country, the last trip I took was to help me get out of that sphere of St. Petersburg and Moscow to really experience the true Russia. You even have those new type buildings in the other bigger cities that are outside of that sphere. Ekaterinburg has quite a few newer buildings. They have the Vysotsky tower that is the tallest building in the city that you can see for miles out into the countryside. So it's definitely more technologically and financially advanced than what people might think of because of the Soviet era image.
And so you talked a bit about the historical sites that you really wanted to visit, the Romanovs, I guess, tomb, or however you would probably say that. Where else did you go on that first trip? And then kind of coming out of that, what was the top of your list stuff that you wanted to see next?
That first trip to St. Petersburg and Moscow, St. Petersburg was nothing but the Romanovs. I wanted to see the Church of the Savior on Spilled Blood, which was where one of the Romanov czars was assassinated, and a church was built on top of that spot where he was killed. The Hermitage, which is the famous art museum. The Catherine's Palace, which was one of the main residences for the previous or the last royal family. Peter's Summer Palace with the big fountain that everyone will see the golden statue and think, oh, that's exactly where Peter the Great stayed. Peter the Great had one of his big palaces. With Moscow, it was wanting to see St. Basil's, of course. And then, let's see, there was a couple of spots in the Kremlin, which to an audience that I speak to, I try to let them know that the Kremlin is actually a fortress. It's not a governmental entity. So I go into the Kremlin and see all these amazing churches. I get to see Yuri Gagarin's tree that he actually planted, and it's like a national symbol. And then after that trip, it was just, I felt this, what I would say is like my soul had this connection to St. Petersburg. So I started learning all about the siege of Leningrad at that time in World War II. And the next time I went back, I told my guide, I want to see anything that's related to the siege. So that first trip was just laying the groundwork for everything into the future.
Okay. And so I know you were just recently back. Had you gone back in between as well?
In between I was actually at a education conference by a company named Nine Valley in Tallinn, Estonia. And Tallinn and St. Petersburg are just about a 6-hour train ride apart. 8 hours if you account for the border crossing time. And that particular time, it was just, I have a weekend free from the education conference. I'll just take the train. And that's when I told my guide I'd like to see any type of museum to the siege. I wanted to see what is called Piskatovskoye Memorial Cemetery, which was where all of the siege victims, the siege deaths, everyone that died in the city was buried in mass graves. And Piskatovskoye is the memorial cemetery where all those mass graves are. So that was the interregnum trip.
And then on your most recent trip, you went over to work with a nonprofit. Is that right?
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit more about what the nonprofit does and what you were doing on that trip?
The nonprofit does basically what I was previously talking about with trying to tell people about that the true image of Russia. It was wanting to introduce regular American citizens to regular Russian citizens outside of that Moscow, St. Petersburg sphere. Like, we had a few days of orientation in Moscow, and we actually we got into groups of 2 to 4 people and got on trains or planes and went to various different cities throughout Russia to meet with people. My group was actually in Yekaterinburg, and everything that we did was circled around local Rotary Club. And we met with business people. We toured businesses. We obviously went to historical sites, given Yekaterinburg's history with the Romanovs and their assassination. And we just worked to show people that citizens from both countries can coexist and can have those friendships that people generally think that don't or can't exist.
Yeah, that's really interesting. This episode is brought to you in part by Zicam. When you're traveling, moving from climate to climate, changing temperatures and changing interaction with all sorts of different bugs and food and germs, you can often catch a cold.
Trust Zicam to knock out a cold at the first sneeze of the season. Other cold medicines only mask symptoms, but Zicam is homeopathic and clinically proven to shorten colds when taken at the first sign. Find Zicam cold remedy products from rapid melts to elderberry medicated fruit drops at all major retailers, including Walmart. Zicam cold remedy products are safe and effective. Visit Zicam.com/wanderers to receive a $2 coupon on your next Zicam purchase. Don't forget to pack Zicam for your next travels. Head to Zicam.com/wanderers to receive a $2 coupon on your next purchase.
And so something I'm curious about is, what do you think it is about Russian history? Obviously, there's a lot of depth there. Obviously, there's that Cold War history as well. What is it that you kind of feel like grabs you about that culture and about that history in particular?
What really caught me was just that story of how we got from A to B. Like I mentioned earlier, where you went from what seemed like a loving mother figure, in quotes, a loving mother figure in Catherine the Great, to this massive entity known as Stalin, and all of the brutality that came with him and from him. I couldn't grasp how we went from such a loving, seemingly loving story and person to someone who is the definition of brutality. Just that story of human beings being capable of that to a 5-year-old just didn't compute. And I just had this curious streak. Growing up, I was kind of sheltered, so the only thing that I was able to really gravitate towards was the encyclopedia, the documentaries on the History Channel or the National Geographic. So when I just was repeatedly exposed to those stories, it just made me want to learn more about it.
Yeah, I feel like there's something as well that I've always found really like personal about travel in terms of the things you've learned and the things you experience. I remember in I think it was in grade 11s, I took an ancient civilizations class in high school. And one of the things that came up there was about I believe it's the Moorish invasion of Spain, and kind of just how one city in particular, about Cordoba in Spain, had shifted back from being a Christian city to a Muslim city, and then back to a Christian city. And there was actually a church/mosque there that had been converted back and forth a number of times over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years. And then the first time we went to Europe, it was a place that we were able to go. And it felt like so cool just to think back to myself at 16 years old, learning about this in the classroom and how like far away it seemed to like actually being there in person. So I do think there is something really cool about having that experience of like the things you've learned about when they seemed like so far away, being able to like go and be there right in person.
Right. That was the main realization that I had when I was first there. That first time in May of 2017 was the television screen is no longer between me and it. I can see St. Basil's with my own eyes. I can touch St. Basil's with my own hand. And just that experience, like you said, being there in person, being able to feel the history just coursing through you, and kind of reaching into your subconscious, your soul, really does leave a mark.
Yeah, absolutely. I've said it a bunch. You've probably heard us say it on the podcast, but I feel like for me, I always found history and like social studies classes to be quite uninteresting. I just felt like learning about these things that were so unconnected to my day-to-day life just wasn't something that interested me. And it wasn't until I went to, Europe and other places in the world where having that like sensory experience with it, like being able to touch something, being able to experience firsthand, like, wow, this is the magnitude of this event, or that, this is the impact on a culture. That's when I was like, oh, okay, history is really not boring at all. It's like, has a lot of emotions and feelings wrapped up in it, but it's really hard to kind of get that through a book. At least for me, it was. So yeah, it's really cool to be able to have those experiences, and this is definitely making me want to go to Russia. I'm curious. I think with a lot of countries that have sort of these stereotypes through the media, through the news, it's like you get a certain, I guess, like you sort of feel like a culture is going to be a certain way. And you sort of mentioned before your experience with Russia has been very different than, what is portrayed in the media. But I'm curious, like, what is sort of the culture like? Like, how is it different from, American culture? And, how is day-to-day life there sort of different from, how we live?
I would say the biggest, because one person actually told me that Russia is kind of like America 30 years prior. It's still gaining its feet. The 1990s, one of the people on this last trip was saying the 1990s were kind of like a lost decade. That 30 years, America 30 years ago comment was kind of talking about the experience of people that are kind of having to reinvent themselves professionally and educationally and things like that. The biggest thing that I noticed personally, and this is just generally, I never understood the exchange rate. Even before I traveled, I never understood how a dollar could be more or less valuable to a pound or a ruble until I got there, and I realized that you have so many rubles, like say $300 is 18,000 rubles. You think you have a lot more money, but you actually don't. It's the same purchasing power of that dollar, but in a different currency. So I would think that I had a little bit more purchasing power, but going into a store and finding a shirt, it was a shirt from the National Olympic store, the Olympic supplier, finding out that shirt was 12,000 rubles rather than, and was going to be, say, 125 US dollars of my 300 US dollars. I wasn't prepared for that reality of, it's not that you have more purchasing power. It's the same purchasing power, but in a different currency. So for me, that was the biggest difference in the daily life of Russia, was that the price of certain commodities is just something that you have to understand, that our minimum wage and their minimum wage are a little bit different, but you just have to, it's part of the daily life, trying to figure out how you can make those purchases in a sustainable way.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because I think for us obviously it's something I think you kind of like understand conceptually, right? Like being at home, you see on the news, especially for us being from Canada, in the news, it's always like Canadian versus US dollar, Canadian versus US dollar. You're always kind of aware of the difference in the rates and the value. But then that first time really going and especially for us, I think it really struck when we went to Southeast Asia for the first time, just after college, and you're going from country to country to country, and the values nominally of each of those currencies is so different. So you're in Thailand one day and it's like, okay, it's about 30 baht to $1. And then you cross over to Vietnam, for example, and it's like 1,000 Vietnamese dong for $1. And there's this sensation at first of like, okay, I know in my mind that like if something costs like whatever, however much it is, you just convert it. But there's something that feels a little bit different, right? Like when you're paying and it's like, oh, this thing costs 20,000, this thing costs 30,000. For us, my experience was almost like, the currency is worth, a lot less, and you aren't maybe as like scrupulous as like, okay, how much is this actually? You're more willing to throw it around.
There were a couple of times like that for me.
You're just like, oh God.
I really just give that guy a $7 tip for, a $4 cup of coffee.
That's so funny. He's probably like, oh, wow, these Americans are sure generous.
Right.
Maybe not the worst thing you've done.
Oh, yeah. But the one for us I think it was in Colombia, and I don't remember the denominations, but it's similar there where they've just, their peso has lost so much value over time that I think it's that they have a 2,000 peso bill and a 200 peso bill. And so if you go to buy like a water, it might cost you like a couple hundred pesos. I could be wildly off on that. But occasionally as like a tourist, because the 2,000 peso bill and the 200 peso bill look quite similar, you might give a 200 or 2,000 peso bill, which is way more than it needs to be for a price of water. And some people will like just keep it because they realize that you don't know what you're doing. And so it's something you kind of needed to be aware of. So one question I have is, I think a lot of people listening, a lot of people in general, like traveling, I always feel like there's a bit of a spectrum between adventure and vacation. And so a lot of people, when they think travel, they think, blue ocean waters, white sandy beaches, beautiful views on mountaintops, that type of thing, like a tropical escape. What is it about travel for you, and especially travel to Russia, that provided fulfillment? Why should people consider, instead of searching out a beach, searching out something like a culture they really love?
For me, the other part that I write on is personal growth. So I was trying to find the balance of happiness versus fulfillment. For me, the travel was about that fulfillment. Like, I never wanted to go to Russia for that Instagram photo that was the perfect lighting and the perfect angle. No, I wanted to really understand from a first person perspective something that I've always admired from afar. So for me, travel is nothing but fulfillment. I recently said to someone that even though I'm on the travel I'm in the travel industry, I want to become a larger known writer with my website and kind of be a digital nomad in places. I don't want to ever make people think that they're going to see a picture of me on a sandy beach with my toes in the sand and my laptop propped on my knees, and in the corner it says Bali, Indonesia, and it says sign up for my $1,000 course. That will never happen. The travel for me has never been about the monetary value. It's always been about the fulfillment of myself personally and to know my fellow humans in a more one-on-one fashion.
Yeah, I love that. That's something that we can relate to too. And, I love sandy beaches as much as the next person, and I love great photos. But I think that something we've really tried to do as we've been working remotely is to, keep it real that the beach is a separate time from our work time for sure. And yeah, I really love, the writing that you've done, and I'm sure that will do, or that you will do, and how your message is very much about, I guess, like breaking down this stigma of a place that I think for a lot of people, potentially ourselves included, it just feels like somewhere that maybe we don't want to go because we don't feel welcome, I guess. And I was thinking about, as you've been talking, what needs to happen sort of in the travel space to I guess really get rid of these stigmas around countries, and particularly Russia. I've thought a lot about, like, even with being in Mexico, like, we really love Mexico. We're in Mexico right now. We lived in Mexico City for quite a while, and I think it's somewhere where we'll continue coming back to. But I think for me, it's like being Canadian. I hear a lot of people who are, they've only been to Baja or Cancun or Puerto Vallarta, and they only want to stay in resorts because they have this idea that, Mexico is really dangerous. And sure, there's danger everywhere in the world. You can find danger in the average American or Canadian city. But for me, it's been so much about, like, diving deeper into the Mexican culture and discovering something that's not just an all-inclusive and a beach and speaking English. Like, we really want to get to know, like, the food and the culture and the people here. And I get the sense that that's really what you are trying to do with Russia too. So I guess I'm curious, like, outside of, bloggers like us writing posts and kind of trying to break this down, what do you think needs to happen for people to I guess, like, start to understand that Russia is a great place to go and visit?
The one other thing that I can think of, just listening to you talk about, Mexico being unsafe, a lot of people would ask me, well, did you ever feel unsafe in Moscow, or did you ever feel unsafe in St. Petersburg? I'm like, well, I can tell you, if I saw a dark alleyway, that's travel safety 101. You don't walk into a dark alleyway because you don't know what's on the other side, or you don't know what's in. But that's kind of common knowledge, or you would think would be common knowledge. I would just want people to kind of step away or step out of themselves to understand that their world is much, much bigger than what they might see that's in front of them. I think I've spoken or kind of shared with your guys' Facebook community how, my motivation for traveling certain places has been, okay, I, as an American growing up, this is what I heard about X country, and there's got to be something that's beyond that. Like, I went to Poland specifically because I said, here in the U.S., you think of Poland for its World War II experience. And Poland has been around for so long. It was such big power player in the earlier European medieval and Renaissance age, that type of time, that their World War II experience kind of overshadows it. And I want to help get people to understand that the world is much bigger than a 4-year period, or a 30 by 30 trailer or house, or whatever you want to call it. I want people to really get a sense of where they are in the world. They're a small little dot in this big marble.
Yeah. And so for someone who's considering a trip to Russia, what would you think would be like a good itinerary if someone, like, let's say, had 3 weeks to travel? Where should they have on that top of that list?
One of the things that I would definitely say, you could definitely spend 3 weeks just in St. Petersburg and probably not even scratch the surface. I would say that if you can, definitely try to get out of the Moscow, St. Petersburg sphere to experience that true Russia. But also don't neglect the history that's staring you right in the face in Moscow and St. Petersburg. There's tons of either imperial era stuff that you can see in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. To me, I always say Moscow, or at least the first time I went there, kind of not so much now. Moscow seems much more, I always say, rustic. because Moscow is 800 and some years old versus St. Petersburg's 300. So you have that definite difference in feel, but I would say that there's so much history in both places that you can just pick a spot on the map and either walk to it or get a cab or even get on the metro. I had my first metro experience in St. Petersburg and in Moscow this last trip, and I can definitely say I will be taking the metro rather than hailing an Uber anytime soon after that.
Yeah, awesome. I know I think we're probably bad for that as well. I do think that Ubers can provide interesting opportunity to chat with someone, but I think in Mexico City, we did the metro one time as kind of like, okay, tick that off. Now we're back to Uber and just Ubering around everywhere, which, to be fair, though, I feel like we get a good amount of like connecting with people because we're able to chat with our Uber drivers. So, Kenny, one of the things I really love about your story is that you really, have this deep intellectual interest and dove into it. You've, read, learned a lot about the history, and then have a very active approach to your travels to kind of dive deeper and to make that real in your own personal experience. So, for anyone who's out there who is a bit curious about Russian history and maybe hasn't got more than that surface level stuff, or seen Rocky IV and learned about Ivan Dragic, I think his name was. What are some good books and resources for people to check out? Like, is there any kind of 1-2 books that you think like right at the top of the list if someone is curious about Russian history?
Oh, wow. Several books, several YouTube programs. I can definitely probably talk for several minutes on that. The biggest, the two authors, just generally that I can say for history wise, Robert Massey, and his, I believe now ex-wife, Susan Massey, are tremendous Russian experts. So anything that they've written, I would definitely recommend. Helen Rappaport has done so much good research and written incredible books. That was Helen's book, the last days of the Romanovs, tragedy at Yekaterinburg, was one of the pieces that made me think, okay, I've got to make to Russia at some point in my life. I've got to hit Russia so I can learn from the source about this story that I've spent my entire life on. There's a Russian media company called Star Media on YouTube that has an entire English channel. They have their programs in English, and they have a 8-episode series on the Romanov 300-year dynasty that is not something that, like Amanda was saying, it's a textbook, dry. I don't know if I would really like this. No, it's presented as if it's a drama television series that the history is interwoven. So there's those two authors and that particular Romanov YouTube series that I can definitely recommend.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely make sure to add those links into our show notes. One other thing as I was thinking about it, it was reminding me of one really kind of like mind-bending experience for me. I was listening to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History series, Ghosts of the Ostfront, which is about World War II, the Eastern Front between the Soviet Union and Germany. And there's just like obviously very sad history around that, but something so different. And the story that gets told about that war growing up in Canada, growing up in the States is so different from, a lot of the events that, not so different, but you focus on the side that involves Canada and the US when so much of that war was, the events that happened were Soviet versus Nazi as well that don't really get covered in our history. And there is like a, depressing but very interesting history along with it there.
There was, when I was in Warsaw, outside the Canadian embassy, there was a huge boulder next to another boulder and it was actually the monument to represent the Canadian and the Polish soldiers that fought side by side. So I can definitely kind of know where you're coming from with that sentiment.
Yeah. And so if anyone wants to go check out more of your work, find you online, where should they go to find you?
The social links for Instagram and Facebook are at Where the Heart Calls You. And then it's my website is wheretheheartcallsyou.net.
Awesome. We will make sure that there's links to that in the show notes. Kenny, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really cool connecting with you. You've been, in our private Facebook community for a while now, and it's been really awesome to see your journeys through Russia and really, for me, get my eyes opened a little bit. I have known very little about Russia up until this point. I watched Anastasia as a little girl, obviously, which is, not really teaching children much about the actual Russian culture. So, as we were talking, I have this around the world bucket list that I've started for a big trip, Ryan, and I want to take in the next couple of years. And I was like, okay, need to make sure that Russia is on that list. So thank you for inspiring us to take a trip and be more open to the culture. And I hope that you've been able to do the same for some other people listening.
Mm-hmm. I hope so too. And I can say that being in your guys' community, I know, Amanda, you're a big foodie person when you guys are traveling, and every time I have a meal, I'm kind of wondering if I should give you guys a review of what I just ate.
Yeah, you probably should. Yeah, it's cool even seeing, I know you posted a bunch of the food that you ate being in Poland and in Russia, and it's those are two places that as we haven't been. So definitely always inspiring to see the food around the world. And yes, always welcome to send us food photos or food inspiration or things we have to eat when we actually get onto that trip.
To find more information, relevant links, and photos talked about in this week's episode, check out theworldwanderers.com.
If you have a question, comment, or feedback, send us an email at info@theworldwanderers.com. Join our community on Facebook at The World Wanderers or on Twitter at World Wanderers 1. As always, thanks so much for listening.
Have a great day.
Bye.